we are live.
A warm welcome to those attending and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. My name is Councillor John Riley, and I'm the chairman of this meeting, which is the Finance and
Sorry, Councillor, your microphone.
Which is the Finance and Corporate Services Select Committee. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and online under the live broadcast. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm goes off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please make sure that you've switched off your mobile devices or put them on silent before the meeting starts. Please note that councillors on the committee may use their laptops or tablets during the meeting to view the agenda and paperwork. Before we move on to the agenda, I should like to introduce the councillors and officers present, but I'll let them do that, and I shall start on this side with Councillor Lewis.
Councillor Richard Lewis.
Councillor Kaushik Banerjee.
Councillor Kishan Bhatt.
And Neil Fraser, Democratic Service Officer.
Matthew Kelly, Head of Procurement and Commissioning.
Councillor Narinda Garg.
Councillor Gasharan Mand. All right, thank you. So, as far as the agenda is concerned, apologies for absence.
Apologies received from Councillor Tudemaiders, Councillor.
Thank you. Declarations of interest in issues coming before the meeting, apart from the usual ones. Thank you. Right, minutes of the last meeting. I expect you've all read them. It was a very good meeting, very full meeting, and a great deal of information that was given to us. Anybody got any comments on the minutes or any amendments? Can they be agreed? Great. Okay. Item 4, to confirm that the items of business marked in Part 1 will be considered in public and any items in Part 2 will be considered in private. I don't think we've got any Part 2 items, so I don't need to worry about that. All right, we can get on with the business of the evening, which is to continue and start in more detail, as it were, with our procurement issue. We decided some little while ago, in fact, that one of the areas that we wanted to look into was procurement as far as the council were concerned, and we're very grateful to have Matthew here and our guest over the link, and we can see from the papers in agenda item 5 the sort of things that we're going to be looking at, and tonight is a little further detail on our understanding of the legal framework and the legal context of procurement, and we go on to other areas of procurement in later meetings. So I think maybe to start with, Matthew, if you want to take us through this, and we'll hear from Rachel as well, so that would be great.
Thank you, Chair. So good evening, everyone. So we obviously had our last session back in September, and we agreed kind of 3 broad themes. So first is legal and regulatory context, which is what we're speaking about tonight. Then the process of procurement, how we deliver value for money, and then the third theme was around how we protect that value for money. So more around the contract management side of the process. So I think it's really important that tonight we have the conversation about the legal and regulatory context, because it lays some of the groundwork for the process elements and the contract management elements going forward, and some of the constraints that might be on us. So I think it's really important that we understand this as a process. Having said that, I think if we just talk about the law, and with the greatest respect to the lawyers in the room, if we just talk about the law, and I got the sense from our last meeting, you didn't just want to talk about the law in isolation. We want to understand it in the context of kind of the practitioner's viewpoint, I guess, and how it's applied in the public sector. So that's really what we want to do, and I've been fortunate enough to enlist Rebecca Rees to support that today, which is great, as our expert witness. Rebecca's a lawyer and partner, head of public procurement and leading national expert in public procurement at Trowers and Hamlins. Trowers and Hamlins are a firm that Hillingdon use quite often when we don't have the level or expertise of resource within the council's own legal team, and we would often engage with Trowers and Hamlins, and Rebecca supports us in that. So I think the plan for the plan for today, or at least the first 10-15 minutes of it, was to ask Rebecca to take us through two key elements, which is the new procurement bill, which is progressing through Parliament currently, and as I say, it's developing. It hasn't had its full reading yet, but Rebecca will talk to us about what that is starting to look like and what it means for procurement in the public sector going forward. We've been in a relatively steady state on procurement for some time, and these are quite significant changes. And also the National Procurement Policy Statement. So that's been out for 2 years, 1 year, 18 months, I'll go with. It looks at, it's about the delivery of the government's ambitions through procurement and through that kind of the public sector procurement process and the money that is invested in that. So we'll look at that, and Rebecca will kind of talk us through some elements of that and some of the challenges that exist on both of those. And then finally, they're both external elements of the regulatory context, and obviously we have our own council standing orders, and we'll just take a brief look at that and what that means in terms of how I, as a head of procurement, manage the procurement process. So, Rebecca, if it's okay, I'm going to hand over to yourself to talk to committee about those two, the procurement bill and MPPS.
Thank you, Matthew. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me in today. As Matthew says, I'm going to focus on the bill and the National Procurement Policy Statement, but I think it's worth starting off by explaining where we are now, because obviously we're post-Brexit, and interestingly, public procurement was the first area of law, policy issue that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings wanted to focus on. And so in terms of reform and in terms of using Brexit opportunities to sort of seize back control over this area of law, which was unexpected. I mean, although I am head of public procurement and think it's a very important area of law, that isn't always shared by my legal colleagues or indeed policy counterparts. So it started off with the government issuing a consultation called Transforming Public Procurement. And the aim of it is, or as Boris Johnson said, was to have a bonfire of red tape to release local authorities and other public sector organisations from the shackles of an over-bureaucratic process to make value for money competitive decisions. And so you can see the flavour of their ideals and objectives in looking at this area of law. That came out in December 2020. And the consultation looked at all areas of legislative reforms. And they received over 600 replies, which apparently is probably 3 times the amount of replies that they get to government consultations in this area. And so it took them a year to come back with their revised plan for how they were going to transform public procurement post-Brexit. And again, it came into the Queen's speech, and earlier this year, 2022, we got the procurement bill. Now, people think that we might have started post-Brexit with a blank piece of paper for procurement reform, but unfortunately that's not been the case. As you might know, we signed up to, in our own rights, the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Government Procurement. And that's a plurilateral agreement that gives us access to global markets, but also gives the signatories access to our market. And with that agreement comes a set of rules. And that set of rules is a lighter version of the EU procurement rules, which we are currently acting under. So we never started off procurement reform with a blank sheet of paper. And so in terms of transformative effects, the new bill will hold for all of us very similar or familiar concepts and processes. But there are a number of areas of reform that I'll come on to in due course. I just want to pause at this stage and say that the procurement bill is legislative reform. And so that is reforming like the skeleton of the legal rules that we have to follow. An area that has been reformed separately is the policy of procurement. And the policy for procurement previously has simply been about creating a common market for the European Union. So a lot of case law, a lot of practice was about keeping national and certainly local policy out of procurement. But clearly, post-Brexit, we now have an opportunity to be able to set our own policies that we want to achieve through procurement. And that is where the National Procurement Policy Statement comes in. So that's sort of like the meat to the bones. So we have the legislative framework, the skeleton being slightly altered by the procurement bill, and then policy being set by central government and flowed down to local authorities through the National Procurement Policy Statement. We then have for smaller value contracts, what Matthew has put in the papers as a below threshold contract policy, where that, in other words, is the main hunting ground for your local by Hillingdon policy to be pursued. That gives you the freedom. That's the kind of pitch that you've got to play on in terms of being able to pursue purely local agendas. And we can come on to that in further detail. So what does the procurement bill free you up to do? At the moment, we have a lot of different regulations to comply with, and what they've said is that they have created a bonfire of that and simplified the legislation. They've also made it more flexible by introducing a new procurement process called the Competitive Flexible Procedure, where Matthew and colleagues can design their own procurement process that will match the needs of Hillingdon, the needs of the market they're going out to try and attract to the contract, and structure it in a very bespoke way, in a way that wasn't possible before. So we have simplification, we have flexibility, and we also have added value and value for money by emphasising under the new legislation that you can take into account a broader definition of value. So it doesn't just have to be lowest cost. You can take into account the social impact of the contract, what they will deliver locally to Hillingdon residents and service users. You can also take into account net zero considerations and other kind of apprenticeships, training skills, so that added value element to the contract as well. In exchange for that, there is an additional transparency burden, whereby Matthew's team will have to put a lot more information than we currently have to on public sector portals. So there will be additional reporting requirements. For every contract that you let above £2 million, you will need to redact that and publish that as well. And there are the normal sort of notices that we need to put to support the procurement process, and we can go into further detail if that's of interest. But for this increased flexibility on one hand, you will have, as a council, an increased administrative burden in the interests of transparency, openness and fairness. And whether the two equal each other out remains to be seen. So the procurement bill is currently in committee stage. The committee stage, I think it's fair to say that the procurement bill has had a fairly rocky passage through the House of Lords. There's been significant numbers of amendments proposed, both to substance and form. And we still have a couple or a few committee meetings yet to go. They were in the diary, but postponed due to the Queen's passing and the change of leader, Conservative Party. Then we'll go to the reporting stage. Hopefully that will be in November. And we would see the procurement bill going through the Commons, hopefully relatively quickly, and coming out in Q1 or Q2 and receiving royal assent in Q1, Q2 in 2023. Part of the procurement reform recognises that there needs to be a cultural change in procurement, a move away from rigidity and kind of a reliance on administrative kind of processes, and an upskilling and a capacity building in the flexibilities that the bill will now give us. So what the Cabinet Office has proposed is that between the bill receiving and the regulations, there'll be more regulations coming through, receiving royal assent, there will be a 6-month implementation period where the Cabinet Office is rolling out to public sector procurers and to a certain extent bidders, know-how, learning and development, so that people should have an increase of capacity and skill before the bill goes live, possibly Q4 2023 or maybe into 2024. So when we're talking about procurement reform, we expect it to come into force in 2024. Okay, sorry, 2 seconds. Sorry. So that's for the bill. The National Procurement Policy Statement that Matthew referenced is already in force now. And that sets out the key policy aims of this central government and its departments into what it wants to achieve through procurement. It was originally sponsored by Lord Agnew, who was very much supportive of, if you are spending a public sector pound, you need to spend it with a purpose and achieve social value and achieve social impact. And a pound spent that doesn't achieve change for a community is a pound wasted. So you get the drift. There were some key themes that have been written in the papers that central government wanted to pursue. Things like recovery from COVID, upskilling of procurement departments, contract management, and I know that you're going to cover that in a different stream. Social value is all about, from the central government point of view, diversity in the supply chain. So giving small and medium enterprises access to the public sector purse, increasing innovation. What I would say about the National Procurement Policy Statement is that because it's central government, it is necessarily non-place based. So it needs to serve all communities across the nation. So in some respects, the National Procurement Policy Statement gives you a good overview, but there is an acknowledgement that local authorities like Hillingdon will have place-based priorities that you want to pursue as well. And as long as they're not in conflict with the national ones, which, because they're so broad, it's quite difficult to see how they would be, you will be able to pursue through your procurement policy and strategy. So the two instruments really form a kind of cohesive landscape in which Hillingdon will be performing procurement going forward. There is supposed to be a radical shift. And I think what Cabinet Office has said is that you do have more flexibility now and take advantage of it. And I think that must be right, because the transparency administrative burden will increase. And so what we need to do is try and save some energy and some resource through the structuring of procurement processes going forward and making them more fit for purpose than they possibly were allowed to be previously. Is that okay, Matthew?
Yeah, that's really good, Rebecca. Thank you very much.
Shall we at this point see if there's any questions or any issues to raise? Because absolutely fascinating. What it sounded like from what you said at the beginning, that as with everything possibly, that this isn't the answer that people were looking for, or that the industry was looking for, or the operators were looking for. And it's a bit of a sort of hybrid, in as much as we haven't started from a beginning. We've started from a sort of halfway, or at least we knew it anyway. To what extent do you think there's even now opportunity to be able to steer the bill and the provisions more in favour of helping people like Matthew here in particular, but also the whole process in a better way, because we seem to be still tied to EU regulation. Well, from what you said, that's what it sounds like, and yet the idea was to sort of start afresh.
I understand that, and I think that's probably the frustration of the kind of non-procurement specialist, in the fact that I think people, when they envisage a bonfire of red tape, they think about a legislative framework being designed from the ground upwards, and we are certainly not there. I think what there is in some of the frustrations have gone, and we do have more flexibility, so that Matthew can design procurement processes that will reflect Hillingdon's priorities and also meet the needs of your market. And I think that one of the things that is stressed under the new regulations is the ability to go out and before a procurement and see who is interested in bidding for your contracts, what their view of life is, how healthy are they, who they think their competitors are, and not co-design, but certainly have an engagement in that design of the procurement that will then make the subsequent process as hopefully as painless as possible for them, so that they are released to show innovation, give some good, prices, some good ideas, and hopefully perceive procurement as less of a barrier than they currently do now.
All right, thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chairman. I've read the legal context with interest, and I've taken on board the modern slavery elements of it. But I do think that it does seem that the materials aren't taken into account in as much as anti-conflict minerals and anti-child labour doesn't seem to come into it, which seems a shame. And also on environmental issues, when it doesn't seem to pick up on low carbon usage for the manufacture of the materials and the equipment, and also I'm dealing on a big German contract at the moment, and because of their power shortages, they're looking at the power consumption of all the equipment, and that's a big issue in Germany. So I do think it's a bit of a and again, it's good that they picked up on the social enterprises, but there's no talk about social or corporate responsibilities within it as well, which seems a shame.
If you want me to comment on that,
it's not really a question, but it's just it's a missed opportunity, I think.
Yeah, and I think your concerns are shared by a number of the peers in the House of Lords, and there are some amendments being tabled where net zero is supposed to be, or net zero considerations and environmental impact considerations are supposed to be coming forward as opposition amendments to the bill. I think that's why I stressed at the beginning that the legislative framework is very much the skeleton, and then the policies in terms of child labour, modern slavery, environmental consumption should come through in the policies, not the legislative. I think they kind of want to keep that quite neutral. And then with the change of what you can take into account in terms of award criteria, what the government is trying to do is bring exactly what you're talking about into competition design and sort of give a thumbs up to procurement officers such as Matthew that they can take that kind of stuff into account when they're designing the award criteria of a competition. So, but I agree, because we've essentially split legislative reform from policy development, it does seem like that stuff is missing because it's not on the face of the procurement bill.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Councillor Gall.
Yeah, so in terms of, I was looking at the terms of reference, in terms of the policy and the council here, what is being done when we're post-contract to allow for high inflation costs, etc., to allow our vendors to continue to provide value for money in all the areas that you said and not compromise those?
Matthew, did you want me to give an example of what you're doing? I was thinking of
I mean,
schools project.
So what was that one, Rebecca?
I was thinking of the schools project.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure that is one specifically around the legal and regulatory context. It's a really important one, given kind of a lot of the conversations I have every day, and it is it's a mixed approach in terms of depending on the specific contracts that we've got in, the specific challenges that those suppliers have got in, the specific markets that they're operating in. So there's no one clear approach that we say this is how we deal. We've got what we've done probably 6-7 months ago, maybe longer, when this was kind of really starting to come onto the horizon. We've drafted a set of principles. There's 10 principles in terms of how we manage this as an officer group. And for example, we don't just accept an increase. I know that might sound really daft to say, but we don't just accept increases. We go back, we challenge, we ask for written detail on what is driving those increases, and we look at what we can do about it. So in some instances we will need to accept it because it's justified. In other instances we will say, well, actually we think you can do things differently. We think you can deliver it more efficiently for us. Or there might be a case that we say, actually, we don't believe your requested increase, and we might look at going out to tender. So we keep all those things on the table, and I'm really kind of keeping that short. But there's a process we go through with suppliers to come to that point of, okay, are we going to accept it or aren't we? But against the backdrop of, we generally need suppliers as much as they need us. So we're kind of acutely aware of the need to work with suppliers. So certainly around some of the social care world, where they're experiencing real high cost pressures, and we very much approach those negotiations in that vein, that we need those suppliers we don't want them to be cutting corners. So we do that, but that's not getting away from the kind of huge financial strains on the council right now.
It's a good question, but and we'll come back to it, because in the future session, that's another whole big topic about how things are being how things are being managed now, and have been for some little while with inflation and interest being a problem, and being something which our procurement team are very good at in terms of dealing with our suppliers and our service providers, because clearly as the speed of pressure has come upon them as a consequence of inflation and interest rates, we've had to adapt very quickly, but that's an area that we'll come back to at another session, and so for the moment I'm just keen to deal with the legal side and the regulatory framework, but keep that in mind, because that's certainly something that we're looking at, and we'll be asking officers about in a future session. Councillor Batt.
Hi there. I note that proportionality has not been included under Clause 11 of the bill. This is to do with procurement objectives. There's a debate about the introduction of the principle of fair treatment of suppliers and the new principle of procedural fairness during procurement procedures, which has replaced the older principle of proportionality. Fairness is quite a broad, vague term to define, whereas proportionality is arguably slightly better. Without leaving the interpretation of these words to judges, to what extent will we be provided with statutory guidance on the meaning of these terms? For example, delivering value for money.
Thank you for the question, and it's really interesting. And so I've been speaking to the Cabinet Office probably weekly since this came out, and one of the things was that it's a semantic argument that they think that proportionality is not a principle, but it is a method of doing procurement properly. Interestingly, on some of the training materials that will subsequently come out, they do talk a lot about proportionality, and you will see that when they talk about, as you've said, procurement procedures, and award criteria, it says actually the award criteria methodology have to be proportionate to the contract value and how. So I think what we will see is that proportionality, although maybe not a headline principle, is a theme that runs through the legislation. We do have an issue of interpretation, but that is mainly due to what the Cabinet Office has euphemistically called stylistic and linguistic differences. So, and you will have seen those in the principles, that we broadly have the same principles of procurement, but explained in statutory language. So the lawyers that draft our statutes are the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, and so they have taken the European concepts that we may not have loved or we may not have fully understood what they mean, but we made them our own and we know what they mean. Those are now going and have gone in the procurement bill. And the point I made to the Cabinet Office is, this is all very well and good, but I don't want to be arguing with my colleagues, my procurement law colleagues from different firms, as to the meaning of the words for the next 2 to 3 years. Unfortunately, I think that might happen, and there will be no escape for doing that if money hangs off the interpretation of that. And I mean, interestingly, very pro-Brexit Baroness in the second reading lambasted the government that there was still a reference to pecuniary interest in the legislation, which I, for one, didn't know had its roots in European law. So I think what you will see is that proportionality will still be there. Fairness will be translated as equal treatment, as we currently have. But where money hangs off the law, I think we will see arguments of a semantic nature coming forward in this area, and despite people's best efforts, not to encourage that.
All right, thank you. I think what's very interesting is this sort of emphasis or re-emphasis. What is very interesting is that normally with major pieces of legislation, you get the legislation and you get the guidance that comes sort of after it, or at least alongside it. And here we seem to have got the guidance first and then the statute. But what's interesting is this sort of re-emphasis or emphasis on a kind of social business responsibility as opposed to just the cheapest contract that's being offered. And I just wondered the extent of the sort of cultural change that's needed for that to be taken into account, because I'm guessing that for years and years and years, procurers have been driven by what is the cheapest and most effective and best delivered contract. But here they've got to look at a lot of different things. And I can envisage smaller businesses who you'd want to encourage, and maybe local businesses who you would want to encourage, not being able to meet these very important but complex criteria. And yet we also want to encourage the people and the businesses that we deal with. And one side of social business is to make sure they can keep going. And that what we don't do is to put in their way so many regulations and forms that they end up spending so much of their money on that sort of thing.
It's a really good point, and I think it probably comes down to two things, if I can. One is competition design, and I think what we've worked with Hillingdon quite well on is trying to design documents which are templates and are light touch for low value contracts which social enterprises and local businesses may seek to bid for. One, so they get familiar with them, and two, that there isn't reams and reams of unnecessary questions that they're asked in loops to go through. The second is the concept of value. And this is a shift throughout government, and I do a lot of construction work as well. And in that, there is so much guidance and so much exhortation to take into account a wider definition of value. And that means giving a proxy to social impact, not going necessarily for the cheapest if a local business can offer you added value, innovation. So there is definitely an exhortation to move away from lowest price, as in lowest capex price, i.e. what we're going to pay on day one, to consider a more holistic price, which might be over the lifetime of an asset. So you might buy a more expensive boiler, but it might last you twice as long. So, as my mother used to say, buy cheap, buy twice. Too sure my father agreed with that. But the other thing is so there's that OPEX, we call it, lifetime, whole life cost that one could take into account, or the wider definition of value, which is, okay, I'm paying slightly more, but I'm receiving these benefits by going with this supplier rather than that supplier. The problem is that cash-strapped local authorities and other public sector bodies with a limited budget almost don't have the luxury to take the wider definition of value into account. And procurement officers are always under pressure to deliver up savings. And there does need to be a very vigorous discussion as to what is value, and can we afford the value that we want to achieve. And the two are different, and they are very difficult decisions to make.
Councillor Burt.
Thanks. I think just following nicely on from what you've just said about value and SMEs perhaps finding it difficult to with the requirements. There's an introduction in the legislation about KPIs. There's sort of three questions I've got about that. The first is, are KPIs mandatory or is it discretionary when assessing the quality of suppliers? Because there's numerous ways in which performance can be measured, and certainly a lot of SMEs are not used to, using KPIs. Second question was, how much discretion do the council have in setting these KPIs? And I'm presuming there has to be an element of, or principle of fairness between both parties. And lastly, I'm interested to understand the remedies for failing to meet KPIs, other than breach of contract and being debarred, and of course if there's any sort of interim remedies available.
Thank you. A really big question, so I'll try and be quick. So what we've got at the moment in the bill is primary legislation. We will get secondary legislation in the form of statutory instruments coming down the road. Cabinet Office is still considering whether we are going to see them before they are placed before Parliament. A lot of those will have the transparency obligations that I alluded to earlier on in them. I would hope that will elucidate the position around KPIs. But what they've said at the moment is that for key contracts, so expensive ones, okay, so above £2 million and larger, maybe even just the strategic real big whammies, the contractor and the client has to choose 3 KPIs. Now, as it's written at the moment, you choose those KPIs in agreement with the contractor, or if that's, that's leaving Matthew looking a bit aghast, you set them and you get them to bid against them, sign up to them as a contract condition. And then you have to assess them, and that will fall into the contract management piece that we'll talk about in a different session. So you do have the discretion to choose which KPIs those strategic contracts are going to be measured against, which I don't think makes any sense, because then what you have to do is you have to report against that performance to a central database so people can see the performance of your contracts that you've let going forward. And if there are different KPIs and different targets to meet, it seems to me a very mixed kind of landscape in terms of performance measurement that's going to create. In terms of what that means, we do have the ability to... in terms of SMEs, unless they are punching above their weight and delivering a strategic contract, it is unlikely that they will need to be evaluated against the mandatory KPIs. You may seek to have a couple of KPIs just to make sure to have that independent view of how that contract is going, but otherwise it's not going to be these KPIs that the Cabinet Office have mandated for certain contracts. In terms of where that leaves you, if they fail against the KPIs and you level against them a remedy or a penalty, or end the contract or terminate it early or whatever, that will be reported and can be a debarment or a cause for debarment under any other public sector contract. It's a discretionary ground under the new bill, but that will actually give a bit of robustness to what we have currently, which you don't, as Hillingdon, if you terminated somebody, there is no way to tell the rest of the public sector market that you terminated this particular contractor for performance. So what you have is this transparency obligation that you will need to report that. That gives everybody else the option to have a look at them, see whether they want to exclude them from any of their tender lists. You talked about remedies. Is there anything else apart from, you said, termination of contract or debarment? I mean, those are pretty they're quite draconian, and that's possibly all you need. But we have KPI management and monitoring clauses, some of your contracts at the moment, that do allow for action plans to be put in place, more remedial contract management, let's try and work through this together, options. And then you do have contract shortening and termination if those action plans aren't put in place. So there is the KPI performance management regime does give you plenty of options going forward.
All right, thank you. I remember Matthew saying to me one time that professionals in the procurement world are very interested in their own world, but we're very interested in it as well, because I've got loads more questions, but we'll have to cut it down to a couple more. Councillor Mann first.
Thank you. A very interesting insight into the legal context, especially, which seems to be the focus of today's meeting. I've got a question, and just in regards to, because this procurement bill is currently obviously going through Parliament, and there are expected to be changes, as there have been already, and the reforms are only done with a view to make changes. In regards to Hillingdon Council and councils of similar stature, once these reforms are made, what do we anticipate in terms of our current practices within the council in terms of dealing with the changes? Do we feel that our current processes will have to change in regards to anticipating the outcomes of this bill? And if they do, how well prepared do we feel we are at the moment in terms of our personnel, in terms of our strategy in dealing with this change, so that we can effectively carry on our procurement processes and be in line with this new bill as well?
Rebecca, do you want to? There's probably two parts to this. I think it's certainly from my perspective, myself and the team are keeping abreast of the changes. We kind of there's lots of guidance from Trowers out there and lots of different papers. It's not finalised yet, so we're not putting all our time into kind of understanding it yet. We know there's going to be some big changes for the team in terms of skills, in terms of capabilities, in terms of processes and templates and these things, and we absolutely need to be on top of those. I think it's a 6-month lead-in time when the bill, when it becomes law, to transition to it. So there will absolutely need to be some retraining. You know, we've known the public contract regulations since certainly since I've started working in procurement. So, and yes, we have revisions to those from time to time, and we get policy notices that come out that. And the National Procurement Policy Statement. So I guess it's in the psyche, that continued learning and development. This is a big change for us, and we don't fully know what's coming, but we will absolutely make sure that Hillingdon is well prepared and my team are well prepared to deal with it and take advantage of it when it comes in. So the flexibility and the value for money aspects that Rebecca's been talking to us about, we'll make sure we're well placed to take advantage of those. Rebecca, is there anything else to add to that?
I don't think so, save to say that everybody's in the same boat at the moment, and it is interesting that the government is giving us 6 months kind of implementation period, because they recognise that it is going to be a big change. I think, having said that, Hillingdon are well placed in terms of procurement capability and current processes to get to grips with the new arrangements fairly quickly in terms of all the additional notices, etc. And being, for example, redacting contracts and kind of the transparency principles are based on the Freedom of Information Act, which obviously your officers are very used to dealing with now. And that is a change from housing associations, which don't have Freedom of Information Act obligations at the moment, so they have a whole new kind of transparency agenda to get to grips with. So I would say that Hillingdon are well placed to go into that implementation period at a trot.
We don't want to keep you too late, so two last questions maybe. Councillor Lewis first.
Thank you, Chairman. I believe in the past we've never been allowed to blacklist companies from tendering if they've performed poorly in the past. And on the contra side, can we actually give positive bias towards companies that have performed well going forward?
I'm probably best to let Rebecca answer this. I think technically we have been able to not involve suppliers who have not performed. It's been a very difficult process, and all the names are always cited around G4S or Serco and others. I think they're making it easier through the procurement bill, but I'm going to Rebecca will give you a far more accurate answer on all those.
No, I mean, the ability to blacklist has always been sort of curtailed by the ability to objectively prove their poor performance, and that does go back to the contract management piece. It does make it easier, and in fact, some procurement colleagues have commented that the debarment regime may be so effective that you might end up with nobody eligible to bid for your contract. So we do have to be careful what we wish for. In terms of positive discrimination, where you have had a positive experience with suppliers, I think again that comes down to contract design, and I think that if that is a sort of ambition of the council, then we need to look at contract extensions whereby positive performance can be rewarded by the envisaged from the outset extension of the contract for another year on the same or similar terms. So I think given enough forethought, the team can come up with something that is in line with that sort of experience that you want to reflect.
All right, thank you. Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chair. Just pick up on a point, Rebecca, and something that Matthew alluded to. How much scope is there to maybe reduce the criteria when selecting sort of contract through FTS? Because in a previous life, I used to work for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and OG was so restrictive, we didn't get any bids or anybody come through. So to cast the net wider, is there a degree of flexibility to go outside, nationally and maybe into Europe, or that's what I'm trying to get to. Thank you.
Yes. So no, entirely good question. So we have all these free trade agreements now, and that gives a far wider pool access to our markets. Arguably, they've been there in one form or t'other, but if there's not been a World Trade Organization Agreement on Government Procurement member, or a member of the EU, they haven't had access to our contracts. And these free trade agreements that we've been ticking off the list will increase that market share. But I go back to the importance of competition design, and actually UNCITRAL, which is the UN Commission on Trade Regulation, have actually set up a new commission looking at the efficacy of competition. And one of their kind of markers of a good competition is how many people you get bidding for a contract. And therefore, this is what I said previously about the importance of market engagement pre-contract, to see who is interested in bidding for a contract. And if there aren't that many, how can we repackage it, re-advertise it, so that we do get bids for it? Because if you think about it, you're a local authority, there is a core stable of contracts that you've got, and they should be attractive to a fairly established and competitive market.
All right, if I may ask one last one, I don't want to keep you too late because I know you've got other things happening behind you. But I suppose it's this, that you did mention earlier on about cash-strapped local authorities and the pressures that local authorities and we, like every other, have suddenly come under. And is there any sort of provision, a sort of, I don't know, a kind of lay-down provision or something, so that when times are really bad in terms of financial pressures, which we have no control over, then the way in which we're able to deal with procurement, especially in terms of the wider ambitions that are talked about in the papers, are able to be sort of scaled down a bit, because, as you say, ideally we would do all this. But if you're looking at inflation figures running through the roof, or interest rates or contract terms that were negotiated before that happening, is there any flexibility within the bill that says, okay, when I paraphrase, but when things are good, do it like this, but when it's helter-skelter, okay, you've got some flexibility?
So in terms of general financial chaos, possibly not. We do have the concept of dealing or procuring in a crisis, and that's clearly been put in as a response to COVID and the difficulties that the government had around COVID PPE procurement, which is well documented. There is the ability to directly award or to run a sort of sub-procurement competition if you need to, if there's not the market or if there's urgency. And going into a contract, there is an ability to change the contract provisions if external circumstances adversely impact performance levels and prices. And indeed, we've been using any and all of those, with Matthew over the last, 6 months, 8 months. What I would say is I think that would be a good thing to cover in contract design, because all of those things can be anticipated through contract terms and being slightly nimble about specification and optioneering, really, is what we're talking about, isn't it? So it's making sure that you leave yourself enough flexibility under the contract terms to be able to react to an external force without being whacked for damages or other kind of penalties from the contractor.
All right, look, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I hope you can tell from the sort of the nature of the questions and the interest. I hope actually that you'll come back and see us another time, because there's loads more stuff I think that everybody would like to ask, but I didn't want to keep you too late. So unless Matthew tells me that we need you for anything later on.
I don't think so. I think you've been great. Thank you, Rebecca. And no, I think we can kind of touch on some of the things. I think one of the things that's just been important, though, is around the competition design. And I think that the whole discussion about competition design and the SME, local business, social value comes into, all starts to tie together, because we've got this situation where the competition design and the working with local business, do we want to, and this for me is part of the challenge as a practitioner, is do we want to disaggregate, say, our kitchen and bathroom contracts to enable the smaller local SMEs to have that opportunity, but in itself that creates difficulties for officers and for the council in terms of managing multiple relationships. So instead of having one £2 million contract, we might have 7 or 8 smaller contracts to that same value. And I think the other piece around, and kind of we frequently have these conversations, is the social value piece. And as Rebecca says, you can measure that social value element, but when we put papers up and there's a contractor who's got £100,000 contract cost and someone's got £110,000 contract cost, but the 110 just edges it on the social value, that's sometimes a difficult sell. We get pushback sometimes in terms of when we do it just on a price quality basis, if we end up going for the higher price contractor. So I think all these things, and this is, I guess, will be discussed in the next session, but some of them are beyond that legal and regulatory and onto that commercial and strategic point that we'll need to get to in terms of potential future recommendations.
And that leads on to a wider question about what we are procuring for and what do we actually want, and direction of travel, which is a whole new area, I think, because in the past, perhaps, it's all been about just getting the best price, whereas this is a much wider consideration. Very quickly, Councillor Lewis.
It's an interesting one, in as much as when you get main contractors on very large projects, it will trickle down to local tradesmen who actually get a very poor deal at the end of the day, and the main contractor's making the profits. So if you can actually manage the smaller local traders, you can actually get better value for money. But there is a cost because you've got to provide the oversight of it. So it's a one for discussion. Yeah.
In my head, I've got this image of those old Saturday night variety things with chaps spinning plates on rods, and there seems to be an awful lot of plates that need to be spun. But look, thank you very much for the moment, Rebecca. That's been fantastic, and we've learnt a great deal this evening. And as I say, I think everybody is all nodding their heads that they would like you to come back and talk to us on a future occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been my utter pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Matthew. Next bit.
So, in terms of the next bit, I guess there's a natural flow, isn't there, onto the standing order. So we've got that kind of, there's the national context, and then we've got this local context, and we've got the council standing orders, specifically around procurement and contracts. And there's a whole range of things in here, and they have been appended previously to this, and it's things such as ethics and probity, member authority, the various thresholds that we need to operate within, how we open contracts. So it's very much a how do we do these things, and what are our rules operating internally. Clearly, they still abide by the public contract regulations currently. I think it's just worth noting in those, and I wasn't planning on having a kind of huge conversation on standing orders, but there is this broad duty for every officer of the council to demonstrate value for money, but it's quite broad. And is there something further down the line? And I think we've got to have these conversations around the social value and the SMEs and the apprenticeships and all those other things that exist within the National Procurement Policy Statement. Do we want to put something in there that says, okay, well, we should have social value in all our contracts and it should be 10% every time? At the minute, we would just keep that. Sometimes it might be 10%, sometimes it might be 5%, sometimes we might not have it in there at all. So there's nothing fixed in there at the minute around these. And obviously we've got an obligation, we've got our net carbon zero obligation, and the extent to which councillors wish to drive that through the council standing orders and have a kind of perhaps a tighter hold on than that might be contained in standing orders currently. So that's the council standing orders element. I don't know if there's any questions around that. I don't know if people have kind of looked at standing orders.
Councillor Gold.
Sorry, just similarly to the national policy around key performance indicators, I know that applies to contracts over 2 million, etc. Do we do anything similar with this area?
In terms of contract management, we'd always try and build in some sort of contract management framework in terms of ensuring, because I guess one of the things, and we will come on to this in other later pieces, is we do a whole piece at the outset in terms of contracting to make sure we deliver value for money. So there's something that we call value leakage, and you can be sure that suppliers are more adept at extracting value from contracts than sometimes procurement officers and contract managers are at maintaining that value. So it's this constant battle, isn't it, in terms of how do we protect that value that we've got in the contracts. And there's a whole array of, the whole suite of tools and techniques that we can, in terms of KPIs or performance reporting, to make sure we protect that for the council.
I think what's interesting is that, as opposed to commercial companies, which may very well have a wide range of procurement needs, local authorities have very wide needs. I mean, extraordinary, and some of them are going to be far more challenging than others, not in terms of size or anything like that, but just in terms of approach. So I'm thinking, for example, in terms of social care, whether it's children or adults, that's a very different thing to, as you were saying before, kitchens and so forth. So the approach, I mean, it sounds obvious, I know, but the approach has got to be different. And in one sense, you can see how the sort of things we were talking about with Rebecca in terms of the social value and local value and the rest of it fit very easily in one type of procurement, so in the sort of social environment, and yet are very difficult to define. And in our paper, there's the sort of suggestion that our standing orders include a duty for every officer in the council to demonstrate value for money. Well, yes, of course. But under this new regime, it's a very different. It's a very different definition of value for money, because you've got to put in a lot of other stuff. Now, what I'm unclear of is if we although we do it, if we didn't do it, how do we get into trouble for not doing it?
So at the minute, I think the terminology that is used is we need to pay due regard to these things. Ultimately, you don't have to do them, but you do need to pay due regard to the social value aspects, and hence the reason we do that, and we try and build it into as many projects as possible. I think it's really important in understanding that social value is what is important to us in terms of social value. So we often take the case of apprenticeships, and you can build in an apprenticeship and say, well, that's social value. But sometimes that's just the business model of the companies that are bidding, because it makes sense for them to bring apprentices along because it supports their workforce planning in the longer term. So I think it's interesting that when we're putting social value, we really understand from an administrative perspective what is important in that social value. What do we want to be getting from the social value aspects, that we're taking up those valuable points to evaluate and score. Because when we look at that my example of a supplier that was 100,000 and 110,000, and we end up going with the 110, we've got to make sure we make more than that £10,000 in the additional value.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. Having looked through the council's standing orders, and maybe this is something we'll come on to in the future, is there anything around tender management? So when you sort of go to procurement and select your vendor supplier, at the beginning you may think that we're going to get this amount of social value for money, but having worked in procurement for nearly 20 years, what you sign up to and what you end up receiving might be very different, so the goalposts move. So something we did think was going to be value for money, for whatever unforeseen reason, there's like additions, they said something was out of scope, so you have to pay extra for it, and the social value is what we started off with. So is there any mechanisms to manage that, to make sure we do sort of come in around where we expected?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and so it's whether it's the social value or the core of the contract, are we getting what we've been and there's a really interesting point here, isn't there? Are we getting what we've asked for? So the first question is, have we asked for it in the right way? And have we all been really, really clear in terms of that specification? Have we got that granularity of detail that allows us to go back to the supplier and say, no, we said we wanted this and you've given us this? And all too often, we might not have that. And that is a challenge more generally in procurement, detailing very clear specifications. I think when we get to that point, it become and if we can say be really confident that we have, then it's about contract management. It's about saying, actually, they've committed to that, and we're now going to enforce and make sure they deliver that. So whether that's number of widgets they deliver every day, or whether that's the social value aspects that we put in there around refurbishing a kitchen in a community hall, if that was important to us, or it's apprenticeships, or it's a host of any other things that come through under social value guise, then yeah, we need to make sure we capture it.
Councillor Lewis.
In terms of comparing the council to a business, in a way, it's a much simpler organisation. I'm probably not going to make many friends with what I'm saying, but we don't have sales and marketing, and we know more or less at the beginning of the year how much money we've got to spend. So actually, procurement is the key fundamental function of the council. Is what we buy and give to our residents. How do you set the level of procurement officers to manage? Because if we doubled the size of if you were allowed to have twice as many officers, would you then be able to control the contracts at lower levels and save money, save more than the cost of the officers? Do you see what I mean? I think
it's a case that procurement people build all the time, that there is a business case for a procurement function, and it should stand on its own 2 feet in terms of being able to evidence that delivery through savings or kind of cost avoidance mechanisms that exist. Sometimes there is a case to say, well, actually, if we invested more in this, if we invested more time, whether that's pre-contract or whether that's post-contract, the value will be great. That takes a certain belief in the process and what we're trying to achieve. I think sometimes you can over-egg the pudding, sometimes you can undercook it. And yeah, I think it's a fair point. It's interesting in terms of the simplicity of the business. I think I just weigh that against I guess the piece that Councillor Riley mentioned around the variety of procurement that we need to do. So that's from social care to fertiliser and weed killer to library books to highways. So that kind of strikes me as being quite broad in terms of the range of services if I think about other businesses that are not retail, but there's a huge range of products there, goods, works and services that we buy.
Maybe, but we are, compared to a large hotel or a cruise ship, they'll have hospitals, they'll have staff levels, they'll have food, they'll have maintenance, and they'll have all the building and I don't know. I think they're. If you take the British Army, they've got similar sort of range of required skills. I guess.
Yeah, and that probably goes with higher spend levels than we would have. But I take your point.
Yeah.
Councillor Burt.
Thank you, Chair. I guess we're talking really about sort of getting the best value out of our, the people that tender or the people that we're procuring with. I'm just wondering if, there's a certain skill set in terms of getting the best value for money, negotiating a good contract, and understanding and negotiating the scope of work very clearly, and also following that up. I'm just wondering if, to what extent we've sort of looked at procuring or outsourcing sort of business consultants or business advisors to sort of help with that process.
We do. In some ways we do. I'd like to think the team can do some of these things. We engage with Trowers, for example, on some of our more complex. So that's an absolute classic example. If you think about the Hayes Regen project, we've worked absolutely, and every step of the way they've supported us through that. And I think it's really important that it's not just, and you probably get that sense from Rebecca, it's not just on the legal aspects. The legal and the commercial are absolutely intertwined in these conversations. So on those bigger projects, they do help us and they do support us. I think we've got to look at, when we look at, and once again using the term competition design, engaging with external parties to do these things when they're smaller contracts, just strikes me as the value for money aspect in that. But certainly on the larger contracts, there can be a value in having experts to do this, because you can take any of these, you can take some of these examples and across this breadth of goods, works and services that we buy, we might only do it every 6-7 years. So, for example, at the minute we're looking at our finance system again. Now, no officer in the council has been out and bought a finance system, particularly recently. So we've engaged consultants who have done this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times before to support us in that process. So we are doing that, but we're really quite selective, because before you know it, it'd be running away with us.
Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the question on the papers, I saw in performance data it says NA. Is there any reporting available on sort of actuals versus performance in terms of the contracts? I know I don't want to keep sort of dwelling on social value, environmental, sort of outcomes, value for money, etc., but like an end of year summary, say these are all the contracts, these are the ones that actually met the criteria in terms of value for money. I know some of it could be abstract or subjective, but is anything like that prepared to see where we came in against target?
So I think we've got NA against performance data there. It just didn't fit properly with the standard reporting format. But taking your question, we do submit KPIs, which is, I can't give them off the top of my head. It's probably coming up to that time again, the 3 months that I do need to do them. But number of contracts that we've tendered, value of contracts tendered, savings, engagement with local business, number of legal challenges we might have had. So there is some KPIs, and I think it could be an opportunity to refresh those and say, well, actually, how do we want procurement to report on performance? Be happy to have that conversation.
Okay, I do want to go back a couple of stages to a couple of questions that you were dealing with when you were talking about. I think Councillor Banerjee was asking about it. You sort of end up with something different to that which you started with, and I just wondered to what extent, and if especially under the new regime, if we are going to have to be much more understanding of why we procure and what we want to procure for, and looking at the outcomes, whether or not, having established those things, do we kind of share that with the potential suppliers in order so that they can see the direction of travel?
Absolutely. So I think we certainly, and once again, when we talk about procurement, this can be anything from £50,000 up to the biggest contracts that we do. So I use these just as examples, but we do that, and we just refer to it as pre-market engagement. So we have a view of what we need to be delivering, and a good example of this is Revs and Bens. So we are reviewing that contract currently, and we need to look at how we deliver it going forward. Now, once again, revenues and benefits, service collections and such like. We have a view of what we want to deliver and potentially how we need to deliver it. But I think we accept that we're not necessarily the experts. There's businesses out there who are delivering this every day. And whilst we don't want to go and just listen to them, because the danger is they'll sell us something, we certainly need to understand the marketplace that we're operating in, and what does best practice look like, and who is delivering it best, and what advancements might have happened technologically and since we last delivered those projects. So that's an exercise that's happening. We're having kind of 6-7 sessions with the supply market currently, long 2.5 hour sessions to really understand what they are. So absolutely, that happens.
All right. Thank you. I think we'll go on.
One very quick question. You talked about KPIs, and that's obviously we report on those to the supplier as well. But do we do audits on them, and do we work with them to actually improve KPIs and performance generally?
Sorry, so in terms of KPIs, my reference there was to internal KPIs, procurement, performance of my procurement team and how we're delivering. Within contracts, would we do an audit? Once again, this would probably be different. I mean, there will be different ways of working in social care. You know, the care CQC will go out and audit those suppliers and make sure they're delivering.
There's a way of making sure that people are maintaining the standards, but under ISO 9001, it's for continual improvement. So do we try and work with our suppliers to actually improve their offering in contract? Because it's to our advantage to get better performance out of them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think there's going to be a definition here, and we need to, or a distinction, should I say, that we're going to need to pull out in the next processes. Procurement in the council don't do the contract management piece, so we can establish it and working with those service areas, but we don't then go and carry on and deliver the contract management. Yeah, no worries.
All right. Well, look, I'm going to draw it to a close there in terms of questioning for Matthew. I mean, we do know that you and your team do a fabulous job and have been doing extraordinary work, especially under the difficult circumstances of high inflation and the other pressures. And we do know that you've been helping our suppliers and those that we contract with in order to make sure the whole thing keeps going. That's a tremendous effort on your part. All right, so next time we look at another area, and we look forward to that because this evening's been absolutely fascinating, I think. But thank you for the moment. Unless there's anything else you want to add in this area.
I don't think there is, Chair, but thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Right, where are we now? Cabinet Forward Plan. Bill.
Yeah, as ever, this is just a note unless the committee has any particular comments.
Anyone got any questions about the forward plan? We can see it there and keep an eye on it, and anything that we want to make comment on, we can do. All right, and then the work programme.
Similar. If the committee has any comments, then now's the time.
Any comments or questions? Well, thank you very much for all that, and we look forward to our next meeting. If I can ask you all just to hang on for a couple of seconds after the recording is finished.